Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first lunch forum of the semester. For those of you who are new to the school, I'm Leora Vysotsky. I'm the staff managing director here at the center, which is also run by a faculty board of directors from across our programs. This year, our board consists of Fernando Lara, who's here, Miriam Solis, Martin Hadish, Nerea Feliz, and Alex Yeshka. In a typical semester, we would also be delighted to be feeding you lunch right now. So stay tuned because it can only get better from here. CAD lunch forums are really meant to be more informal presentations and opportunities for faculty and students to really share works in progress or new directions for their inquiries and research that they might want to receive feedback on or allow for more discussion around. So in order to facilitate that, our presenter will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to questions and discussion before we let you go to studio at 1. So I encourage you to raise your hand or put a question or comment in the chat, and we'll go through them in the second half of the hour. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Ernesto Bilbao. Ernesto is currently a doctoral candidate here at UT Austin. He earned his Master of Architecture degree from Rice University as a Fulbright scholar and his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Universidad San Francisco de Quito, where he's currently also an associate professor at the School of Architecture. He is also founding principal of Estudio Ernesto Bilbao in Quito, Ecuador, focusing mostly on landscape architecture and architectural design. His ongoing dissertation focuses on the consolidation of the old airport of Quito and the effects of Quito's internationalization fostered by the airplane from 1920 to 1960. His research touches on subjects dealing with the construction of buildings indispensable for travel, commercial exchange, international relations, and tourism. Bilbao's other academic interests are 20th century modern architecture in Latin America, decolonization theories, cultural landscapes, and history and theory of landscape architecture. While here at UT, Ernesto has worked as a TA in various courses, and he has also assisted with lectures, presentations, and midterm and final reviews. He has also bridged the University of San Francisco de Quito with UT by inviting SOA faculty to teach at USFQ during the summer. So Ernesto, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your kind introduction. I'm very honored to be presenting here in the City Forum. Really, I'm a big fan of this forum, so I'm totally honored. Well, so I'm going to share my screen so we can proceed. Let's see. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
All right, fantastic. All right, so thank you so much, Laura, again for your presentation. I think it's an honor for me to be presenting here at City Farm. What I'm going to present today is ultra super very short version of the last 12 years that I've been working around the same site. A site historically based on altitude and verticality exercised by condors, airplanes, kites, and even drones. But because of the site's chronological history, in which the same place was a large lagoon, a conglomeration of haciendas, an airport, and nowadays a park, it is also valid to have called this presentation the site of water, agricultural fields, runways, and dirt. I could have also used the proper names for each one of these historical phases. The title could have also been the site of the Añaquito Lagoon, the Hacienda Iñaquito en La Carolina, the Mariscal Sucre Airport, and Parque Bicentenario. To some extent, this talk is a combination of sky and ground. The site I'm going to talk about is located in Quito, Ecuador, where I come from. My interest on this site began in my pre-thesis class at Rice University in the spring 2008, from which you can see some of the diagrams that I produced for that class. Since the construction of Quito's new airport had begun in 2006, My thesis' main question had to do with the future of the void being left by the old airport and the site's future environmental relationship with the city. To that point, Quito's urban development and expansion had already surrounded the entire old airport, leaving 2-mile-long void trapped within the city. Under these circumstances, aerial operations became dangerous and few accidents have occurred in the vicinity of the void. In the following semester, I found myself working in the international design competition for the Parque del Lago with my good friend and classmate, Robert Sproul Jr. Both of us captured very young in this photo that we see in front of us. The competition, unique for its characteristics in Ecuador, called for design ideas for the transformation of Quito's old airport into a park, whose closure was scheduled by then for 2010. In addition to the fascinating subject and monetary prize, the competition's jury made it even more interesting. Charles Wyham from Canada and the US, Jordi Borja from Spain, Rosa Clias from Brazil, and Urana Mathur from India and the US, and Henry Carrion from Ecuador, respected landscape architects, urbanists, and architects, composed international committee. It happened that Robert and I won the competition amongst 196 entries from 25 countries. Winning the competition literally changed my life in the years to come. The silhouette of the title, Aterriza tus ideas en Quito, Land Your Ideas in Quito, found in a promotional flyer of the competition, obviously implied aspects of flight and landing. But more interesting than that, Robert and I wanted to explore the gravitational pullback or the vertical relationship implied between the Andes and Quito. The aerial perspective that we produced purposely aimed at exploration. Quito's verticality is more obvious from the sky or from the aerial perspective. Quito's altitude at 9,000 feet and location over a very elongated valley, perfectly defined by the Andes and the Pichincha volcano, is more evident if seen through aerial perspectives. The aerial vision allows us to understand the implied complexity between the city, mountainous formations, valleys, and ravines, and the permanent relationship that the city has with the Pichincha volcano, located on the left in this image. If seen in a section, the vertical relationship between the volcano at an altitude of 15,000 feet and Quito's valley becomes more obvious. The difference lies, however, not only in altitude, but also in the drastic transformation of the climatic and ecological force between the profile of the volcano and the valley of the city every 3,000 feet. Quito's valley, before the city's human expansion during the colony until today, was completely covered by an Andean humid forest, which contrasted with the perpetual glaciers located at the peaks of the Pichincha. This cordillera was part of the sacred landscape of the pre-Columbian inhabitants, but also a habitat of the Andean condor, which, despite of the few existing specimens, still flies between the Pichincha and other volcanoes near the city of Quito. It is very possible that the sky of Quito's valley had been dominated by the flight of condors. The painting Pichincha on the left by Frederick Church, who visited Quito in the mid-19th century, helps to visualize the landscape of the condor below the Pichincha volcano, a landscape comprised of ravines, creeks, and humid forests, but also of lagoons, as depicted in his painting, Twilight in the Tropics, also near Quito, that we see on the right. Despite the romanticism imprinted in Church's paintings, they are not too far from reality. The Spanish soldier Juan de Salazar Villasante, who was in Quito in the 16th century, wrote about the existence of a large lagoon north of Quito, where large numbers of ducks and herons live, and where Spanish soldiers hunt large numbers of deer. Indeed, de Salazar's narratives also agree with Quito's descriptions made for relaciones geográficas, geographical relations, requested by King Philip II to estimate his belongings in Spanish America in the same century. In fact, the presence of a large lagoon called Añaquito by the pre-Columbian inhabitants corresponded to the natural drainage, accumulation, and flow of water from the Pichincha volcano and eastern mountain ranges through ravines and creeks. Therefore, the Añaquito Lagoon was a superficial and natural pond that appeared during the rainy season. In the dry season, or in the summer, the basin of Quito's valley never ceased to be a landscape of water comprised mainly of wetlands and swamps. During the colony, and until the mid-20th century, the water bodies and wetlands of the Añaquito Lagoon created the perfect conditions for livestock grazing and agricultural production through haciendas, an expressively feudal agricultural production system owned only by the hacendado, the landowner, usually of Spanish or white descent. After the lagoon was infilled for that purpose, Quito's rural and peripheral space belonged entirely to the hacienda, where agricultural production was carried out by indigenous people living within their limits, who in exchange for their work received money, grains, firewood, few animals, and a small plot of land called Huasipungo. The indigenous people living in these haciendas were dissimulated slaves subject to low wages, insults, and physical abuse by the landowner. The cruelty of the haciendas made the Ecuadorian writer Jorge Casa consider it to be the tragedy of the Ecuadorian Indian in 1934. In 1920, managed by Quito's elites and with the aid of European immigrants and entrepreneurs, the first airplanes landed on two haciendas, Hacienda La Carolina and later the Hacienda Añaquito, both located at the lower grounds of Quito's northern environs, only 7 miles apart from the city. They offer optimal conditions for first flights, open space for maneuvering, with plenty of predominant wind in the north-south directions. This land will become Quito's first airport, known as Campo de Aviación, in the 1930s, which appeared in the maps of Quito and Cotocosao in 1939. These maps depicted the city in contrast with its northern environs, a territory marked by dozens of ravines and haciendas. The next map to the north, Cotocosao, depicts the Campo de Aviación surrounded by at least 15 other haciendas, and land divided into smaller agricultural properties called quintas, farms of considerable size. Despite a few roads and gorges running through, the borders between haciendas and Campo de Aviación appear unclear. From the 1930s, this elemental and rustic airfield became Quito's Mariscal Sucre Airport until 2013. To me, it's always interesting to think the shift of power from the hacendado to the international and corporate airlines. Since the construction of the first modern terminal and runway in the 1960s, the airport occupied an important area within the whole city and had a lot to do with the configuration of Quito's urban form. Returning to the competition, other factors add complexity to the relationship between this site and Quito's elongated valley. Amongst the material that Robert and I received for the competition organizers, we found two diagrams to be the most important. The first one, on the upper left corner, depicted Quito's ecological systems occupying the valley. The airport lies perfectly in between the two opposite habitats. To the south, a humid forest, and to the north, a drier landscape, basically defined by steppes. Aspect that was corroborated by another diagram that showed Quito's rainfall along the valley. This diagram showed that it rained more towards south and less towards north of the airport. With these considerations in mind, our first sketches wanted to address these facts by the development of three different landscapes across the park. To the south, a denser humid or cloud forest, and to the north, a landscape based on a prairie. The space in between belonged to a transitional dry forest and urban agriculture. In addition, two other ideas organized the park. One was to create adequate cross-circulation zones from which vegetation will expand, and the second, perpendicular roads running through the park that will facilitate connection between the edges of the city, perfectly divided by the presence of the airport. Each one of these roads would provide a different ecological experience. In addition to the road integration, we also thought of how to integrate the new park to a larger ecological system, one that might facilitate avian migration with other existing parks on large green areas, and also how to integrate the park to become part of the central corridor along the city's main axis. Within this context, the concept of the park emphasized the irony of the juxtaposition between city and wilderness, in which a space is transformed between the order and the uncontrollable, the foreseeable and the unpredictable, the cultivated and the untamed. We wanted to make visible the measure of the modern metropolis against its natural counterpart, especially in the volcanic context of the Andes where Quito is situated. The park's elements included many amenities, including a modern conference and convention center, a cultural promenade, where new and renovated buildings will house science and education facilities relating to the ecology and agriculture of the park, a municipal round market selling items grown on site, playing fields, and dozens of miles of pathways. The proposal reinforced the configuration for a multitude of activities such as cultural, recreational, agricultural, or business, so that there might be a maximum of people present to take part in the daily life of the park. A key element in the competition was the development of the aerial perspective. We have learned from our readings from Charles Wyham and James Corner of the impact that aerial view had on design practices and planning. Therefore, we put particular emphasis on this image, which combines the exploration of the aerial vision with future developments of airport landscapes, which might not be evident from the ground. We thought of the park's ecology to develop in stages, beginning with existing conditions which could easily be open to the public. Having the site divided into various parcels of land created by the extension of Quito's surroundings grid, they can be viewed as a series of petri dishes, each home to its own ecological experiment. Some tracts of land will have symbiotic relationships with those surrounding them, while others might collapse due to their juxtaposition with others. In this way, the park is a living thing in the city. With this discussion, caretakers of the park become a pilot, gently steering a vessel. There might be intent, but it might have to be compatible with what the park demands. The main three intentions for landscapes will develop over decades, eventually becoming a refuge for species with endangered habitats. We also emphasized that the evolution of the park depended on a future conversation with the city, and we wanted to make sure that the site plan was only one possibility and that the process will guide and determine the final form. Later, the winning proposal was included in the airport landscape exhibit made at the GSD in Harvard University, and later published in its catalog in 2016. Months before the airport's decommissioning, Quito's municipality hired me to develop a plan for the first stages. The first one obviously comprised, as I mentioned before, the opening of the park practically with existing infrastructure. For that purpose, several schemes were considered for temporary uses and entrances to the park, mainly taking advantage of hard and soft surfaces and the scarce budget that the municipality had at that time. Several clusters distributed in several places along the old airport were considered for sport activities, shaded spaces, and to promote the planting of trees in soft areas. Emphasis was also placed on the confinement of several areas of the park for environmental remediation, or for the beginning of the construction of the city's new metro, new roads, the new cultural promenade, and the convention center. And we suggested how to schedule specific interventions to facilitate the development of the particular areas of the park. And also, we designed a first proposal for the park's topographic profiles. So after the airport ceased operations in 2013, not in 2010 as initially scheduled, it was fascinating to see the social response around the event. Despite the fact that that noise and risk of accidents will pretty much disappear, Quiteños felt nostalgic with the airport decommissioning. At the eve of its closure in April 2013, the old airport was surrounded by posters hanging its fence saying, "Gracias Mariscal Sucre, hasta siempre, adiós." And thousands of people waved goodbye to the last airplane taking off from its runway. Eating mariachis, not an Ecuadorian thing, farewell at the airport's fence. Now transformed into a public park, these memories speak of the infrastructure, cultural, and historical stature during its years of operation, and the need to revalue and understand its presence in Quito's history. In the opening day, almost 300,000 people visited the park, aimed to put their feet on the runway, and to experience the more than 300 acres of new public space. A space that after the park's opening did not belong any longer to airplanes and international corporations of aerial transportation of goods, freight, mail, and people. Now it belonged to the regular citizen of Quito. Despite the presence of hard surfaces and existing aerial infrastructure, people began to accept the park, understanding it as a new typology of landscape. Now in Quito, it's very common that every single child learns how to bike or skate, taking advantage of the former runway and taxiways. As Fernando Lara, my dissertation advisor, recommended once to me, the transformation of the airport into a public space becomes an interesting gesture of decolonizing its space. Now children and people of all ages take advantage of the prevailing wind for other purposes, such as flying kites, a traditional activity that usually took place at other parks in Quito, especially during the summer when the wind is stronger. And even municipal agencies call for kite competitions or give away kites for family entertainment. Probably the most spectacular event hosted at the park corresponded to Pope Francis' open mass in 2015, when more than 1 million persons attended the service coming from all over Ecuador or other countries in South America, such as Colombia and Peru. In 2016, another possibility came to the park, for the park with the construction of Quito's new metro, which is the reddish line that we see in the map. Quito's municipality then asked me to design a new master plan to reuse more than 2 million cubic meters of earth extracted from the construction of the underground metro. It was interesting to think of how two large public infrastructures will relate and benefit each other. The task involved the design of various profiles and earth mounts with the idea of creating various natural habitats and microclimates that will control the wind, collect water, increase humidity, create denser vegetation ecosystems, and habilitate different landscape typologies dedicated for various purposes. The project became an important opportunity to recreate the landscape once present in the Valley of Quito, composed of wetlands, ravines, and forests, all intermingled with part of the existing hard surfaces of the old runway and taxiways. Only half of the expected earth came available. Nonetheless, the almost 1 million cubic meters received served to create the topographic profile of almost a quarter of the park at its northern end. The task of accommodating this amount of earth implied precision and care, and Andres Vaquero, ecologist and head of the park construction office, ingeniously used his own drone to calibrate every single deposit and process of consolidation. The use of the drone not only became an important tool for the logistics of the project, but also a fascinating new way to observe the park again from the air. The drone allowed us to contemplate the beauty of the site's transformation over the time, as well as the complex relationships that still persist between the park and its surrounding reality. The drone also became a tool for an elevated observation in which we, as designers, could reflect and validate our decisions, but also a way to determine the form of the contemporary landscape of the post-aerial infrastructure. The drone and aerial view, as James Corner would state, helped Andres Vaquero to take measure of the different environments being forged over time, and to read the landscapes from the drone's vantage point of view. The drone enabled this project to move from the flat map conception to a more active engagement with the space of the park. The hundreds of photos and videos that Andres collected using the drone during the Earth project also became a new form to interpret the hybrid quality of the patterns still evolving below, and to contemplate the still undesigned surfaces. This aerial vision articulated space and even the poetics of landscape transformation and public space consolidation. It also allowed to see the enormous physical and environmental challenges and social changes that the transformation of Quito's airport faces every day. As architect, I think of how enormously helpful these photographs were in regard of landscape and architectural design. But now, as an architectural historian, I also see the invaluable historical testimony embedded in all these photos for future research. And now I'm gonna share with you a couple of videos that Andres made. First one is gonna be this one. So this is one of the videos amongst the hundreds of videos that he was able to collect. And we see the northern end of the park and the first stages when the earth from the metro was being deposited at the, on site. And you see all the machinery working on site and the spectacular view that we have from the air towards the old airport or the park. But also, it is also amazing to contemplate the geography that surrounds Quito. In fact, here we have to this corner one of the volcanoes that are near the city. So that's one of the videos, and then I'm gonna share another one. This one instead shows other areas of the park. And this is pretty much at the center in front of the old terminal. And it's very curious that we see here, this is the cross that was made for when Pope Francis visited the city. But it's also interesting to see the complexity of this landscape composition between hard surfaces that belong to the runway and other surfaces, soft surfaces that allow other type of activities. But it's public space. This is one of the things that I really am very happy of the site, that it was transformed into a public space. Something that not really happens in many cities in the world. So let's wait a little bit until this turns. It kind of shows the extension of the old airport towards north. There's where you can see. I think this was filmed before a running competition, 5K or 10K, something like that. And then you're gonna be able to see the old terminal just in front of that, which is this one. This is the old terminal of the airport. And that's the construction of the new convention center. So now let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Observation from the ground, however, is also important. The human scales is also a powerful tool to experience space and to perceive the phenomena that concern our physicality governed by our senses, vision being one of them. Human scale is often so small, but it still allows us to understand and measure the vastness of the reality in which we live. Our scaled and grounded vision, in conjunction with our ability to move, also creates certain illusions in which other realities are obscure or for certain moments. While the park's development moves forward, my doctoral research pulls me back in time in order to complete the pieces of a larger puzzle between 1910, 1920, and 1960, in which verticality and gravitational tension converge architecture, landscape, and geography in a single site. Architecture, because Quito's old airport terminal unveils the complexity behind symbolic aims of progress and cultural import. Landscape, because of the large impact that the airport and its zones of influence had in Quito during its years of operation. And geography, because aviation in Ecuador was not circumstantial. It responded to a larger hemispheric and geopolitical enterprise. Finally, I wanted to conclude with this presentation with this photograph. which is probably the most amazing photo of all. When selecting the photos for this talk from my personal library just 2 days ago, this photograph that I took in 2018 presented to me without notice the most unusual discovery, a flying falcon over the park's new topography. After quickly consulting with Andres Vaquero, I learned that it is a quilico, a type of Andean falcon, usually found in deep risks and ravines near Quito. It is much smaller than a condor, but it announces how nature has begun to claim the sky up above this particular site. Thank you. So I'm very open to questions.
Thank you, Ernesto. I think I am charged with opening the conversation with a question for you. And first of all, I want to say that the afternoon that I spent with you and Andres at the site of the park, old airport, now park, last year was one of the highlights of my visit to Quito. It's really, really beautiful to see the way that you have designed a strategy for nature to claim that site. And of course, it's a new nature. Of course, it's a designed nature, but it is nature nonetheless. And the kids that were biking and the other ones playing soccer and the ones running, it was beautiful to see the people claiming the tarmac, that what was once a tarmac and now it's reverting back to nature. It's a beautiful example and we should always talk more about it and celebrate it. But one of the tenets of the decolonial theory is that there is no modernization without colonization. And in your dissertation, you explore that really well. And the path from the condor to the airplane to the drone. And I don't know if you noticed, there's an helicopter on that photo with the falcon. So in that sequence that now includes also the subway running underneath the tarmac, in all that modernization effort, there are traces of colonization. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that. The ones that come to my mind are the fact that the airport moved to the valley below on Cumbaya and Tumbaco. And also the fact that the park is still named after the Bicentenario. And Bicentenario means the bicentennial of the Ecuadorian independence, which is celebrated now in November, I believe. It was 1820. And by naming that Bicentenario, in a way, it erases the history of thousands of years, both the indigenous history and the Spanish colonial history that are part of Quito. So the machinery of modernization continues, and I thank you for your reference that I said that your park is decolonizing the site. I think it is, but nonetheless, in that machinery, it is creating other colonizing effects, and I want you to reflect a little bit on that. Who's being colonized by the park?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question, Fernando. Well, returning to the last photograph, yes, I think when I was trying to capture that moment, I think I wanted to capture the helicopter instead of the Falcon. But I just realized when I was searching among the thousands of photographs that I have collected in the last years, that it happens that Falcon was flying through when I was taking that photo. I never saw that before until 2 days ago. So it was an amazing experience. Going back to your question, I think, both modernization and colonization are embedded in this site. I mean, throughout the history. And of course, when the mayor, the 2 mayors ago, he decided to name the park Parque Bicentenario, making reference to the Spanish colonization and the independence gained by Ecuador 200 years ago. But I think, you know, in the process, in all the phases that this site has gone through, many processes of colonization has happened. I mean, it is true, for example, especially when during an airport, how the zones of influence kind of colonize not just that site, but also the minds of the people, I mean, the expectations of the people in terms of being connected with the rest of the world and all the businesses and all the transformations that aviation was going to bring for the country. But also the zones of influence have transformed the cultural landscape, not just in the immediate surroundings of Quito, but also in the even miles and tens and dozens of miles away from the city, where old haciendas also were transformed to cultivate flowers, for example, or roses, and how that transformed that landscape far away from Quito in order to collect all those flowers and roses to be exported to other countries. So another process of colonization was also taking place far away from the airport because of the airport. I mean, the best example to understand the modernization, the colonization theory is probably during the airport period. But of course, today, you know, I think it's kind of in between. When the park opened to the public and now it belongs to the public, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to return the site to the people. I mean, to return it to the public practice, and I think that's a very important moment. I don't know. I'm kind of giving ideas all over the place. I don't know if I come to answering your question, but I think it's very interesting to analyze. I mean, many ideas come to my mind in order to respond to your question. Regarding the name, when I was hired to do the first master plan, considering the first stages of the park, I remember that they didn't have a name. I didn't have a name for the park. It was Parque del Lago because of the competition. But for that project in particular, they decided to name Parque de la Ciudad. But also, Parque de la Ciudad also kind of implies, you know, the strict relationship to a city, which also it corresponds to these effects of modernization, you know, the modernization and the occupation of nature and so on. So probably the correct name of the park would be, I don't know, Parque del Cóndor or Park of the Birds, I don't know, maybe as a way of decolonizing also the site, you know, and to make people understand that it corresponds to the site itself corresponds to a larger scope or environment, right? Instead of others. I don't know if I have answered your question for now.
That's perfect, Ernesto. We have questions from the audience, and the first raise up here is Dean Michelle Addington.
Hi, Ernesto. One of the things that really struck me as you started, and it actually brought back a painful memory for me, which was the first time I flew into that old airport, of no matter how many times people had described to me what it was going to feel like, the actual sense of feeling like you're in a massive jetliner going down a city street and looking parallel, seeing people sitting in their offices is an experience that I never want to repeat again. But what it did bring up for me, and I think and each one of us will have a different lens by which we look at your talk, and the lens that I was looking at your talk from actually even began with the first image you had showing the airport in plan, which completely flattened completely flattened the space. And you sort of continue to talk about these sort of different modes and methods of representation of how information came to you as you worked on this project. And it made me really, keenly aware of the failings of orthographic representation to actually address many of the modes by which we want to examine public space, particularly in urban environments, particularly with unusual topographies, but also in the way that you were going through the talk, it was about its history. It was about its environmental performance. The map that you had of the different rainfall and that, factor of 10, more than factor of 10 difference across the airport, bifurcating the end of the airport is stunning. And, I think what it calls to question are whether it's the failings or the opportunities we've missed in coming up with much more robust ways of actually mapping complex landscape and urban environments, not through orthographic representation that gives you one slice through it, not just through the aerial photography, the photographs give you, one slice of it, not just through the environmental or geological analyses that just gives you one slice of it. And I almost felt as though the entire design project was your way of synthesizing all of those different sort of maps, models, simulations, representations on it. And that was what I was seeing for it. So part of it is revealing for me a lot of the failing we have in understanding our normal modes for understanding context, but also sort of seeing in you this sort of ability to find a way to sort of navigate through that. So I'm really intrigued, but I'm also now thinking about a whole area of research that I would like to embark on moving forward. So I don't think I have a question. I just have a provocation.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your comments. Yeah, as a matter of fact, Quito's airport was, I think, one of the most dangerous airports in the world, and I collect also those moments when you were landing and pretty much in the center of the city. And going back to your comments about all these types of representations and research and modes of research that I have used in order to complete the design or the phases of the design, I think it is very interesting because every time that I was seeing something different, I wanted to explore it through section or through perspectives or through diagrams or a combination of all. I really played with that a lot, and I think the more you play with each one of those types of representations, the more information you get that benefit the project, the design of the project. And that was, I think, a fantastic experience, and it's something that I have transmitted to my students back in Quito many times. That the provocation that you have when you experiment, when you play with the tools or the information that you have, right? I mean, and also to create a diagram also involves a lot of playfulness, probably also a little bit of expertise, but maybe more of playfulness in the sense that by overlapping information, by combining sections with perspectives and all that, you gain so many other factors, or you discover other factors that were not visible through planar vision or through the aerial perspective or any other tools. So I think it is also fascinating. I mean, the combination of planar vision, section perspectives, aerial visions, and all that in order to benefit the program. And I think it's something that we need to tell our students all the time. I mean, to experiment, even sketchcamp. When I also presented some of the sketches that I did with Robert for the competition. Playing with the pencil and a piece of paper also informs the design, the process of design.
Next one with the hand up is Sara Lopez.
Hi, Ernesto. My voice is a little hoarse. I'm looking at Fernando, so it's funny because you're little, so I'm gonna look at you up here. That was amazing. I've heard you talk about this project so many times at this point, and I've loved every time, but this is the first time that I really got a sense of the scale of it, partially because I'm not good sometimes reading these architectural representations, and I know you've showed us photos and maps, and now you showed us that video. But I think for me, when you started talking about the moving of the earth, from the subway to this new iteration that you did, is where I just kind of went, wow, right? Where you burst into that kind of, there's so many projects happening at once. I just taught last week in my cultural landscape class about Cahokia, about the mound builders along the Mississippi. And in general, when we think about the initial markers and measures of the landscape, one of the things we think about is moving earth, and earth moving is just such a powerful thing. So for you to talk about in your project, then being given the opportunity to move subway ground, right? Excavated ground, was it to build the subway to the site? And then you did it in these sort of concentric patterns. I mean, that's something I'm going to be thinking about for a while in terms of the symbolic and logistical meaning of that. So that's just thoughts I have, but I do actually have a question for you. My question is, how did this happen? So with my US mind, where I think about public space in terms of US city development, and we have very little space that we're working with, and it's fought over tooth and nail by this kind of framework of extracting surplus value from any square meter of space we have here. So there's always a war happening here in US cities between this ideal of a public that we don't want to let go of, and this reality of a city that's basically built for profit, even partially, at its belly because of the relationship between developers and politicians. And we see that playing out in Austin all the time. And the profit important to kind of keeping the city afloat, et cetera. How did this happen? What's the socio-political reality that allowed so much land, you may have said this and I missed it, to be granted to a use that is not based on exchange and capital, and that actually is expensive, I'm guessing, to maintain on some level? What is it? What can you tell us about the politics of Quito, the kind of governance, the planning mentality, the relationship that designers, landscape designers and architects have, the kind of maybe a reverence for design there? I don't know what it is, but I'm just like, how did this happen? That's my question to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sarah. Good to see you. Been seeing you like in a while. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and thanks for your comments. This also maybe connects with Fernando's comments on decolonization, because, for example, if we think of the construction of the metro, of course, we're kind of colonizing our minds to the use of a subway, instead of kind of getting rid of cars, riding, instead of reinforcing pedestrian circulation and so on. I don't know. Since the city got involved in the construction of a metro, which is a very expensive project, I have my conflicting thoughts about that. But anyways, the decision for the old airport to become a park was made in like maybe 20 years ago. The mayor back then with the council decided that, seeing, and you saw one of the photos, that pretty much the airport became so dangerous that it was necessary to build another airport outside the city. So with that consideration, they decided to write an ordinance to fix that site for public use in the future. It was very interesting, the dialogue and the conversation that started around that. Of course, there were the promoters, the developers that argue against that decision, because they aimed for that site to become, a place for new businesses, for high-rise buildings and all that, right? The speculation of land and all that situation. Even during the competition of the Parque del Lago, many of the competitors and professionals that I know, they were kind of arguing against the competition in the sense that, why a park? Why is the necessity to transform that space into a park? Why not to hire, big developers? Why not to bring a large amount of money from other countries in order to invest on the site, in order to create a new urban center and so on? But I think, the decision was correct in the sense that, this is, I think Quito has a privilege in having that site, and to have it transform into a public space. It's fantastic. That doesn't happen very often in other cities. Here in the United States, many airports have been granted for developers. Here in Austin, for example, it's a kind of a mixed thing. But in Denver, many other airports in many cities in around the world have given that land to developers, and and the site kind of becomes part of the capitalist urban sphere. So that decision taken 2 decades ago about that was pretty much almost impossible to change, was really a facilitator for the transformation of the airport into a park. And that was a key moment for the history of that site, that I really think it's super important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
I have a question, but I can't figure out how to raise my hand when I'm posting.
Just raising my hand.
Can you talk a little bit about how, I'm just going to read my question from the chat, about how the transformation of the site affected the surrounding neighborhoods? I think in the US, we're used to, airport adjacent neighborhoods being less desirable because they're loud and, there's pollution from the planes. But I'm curious if this was the case kind of before the renovation and, is it in the process of changing now after the transformation? Like what's going on in the neighborhoods around it?
That's a very interesting question. There was another master plan that took care of all the surroundings around the airport. The idea was also to kind of promote urban development. I mean, I didn't design that master plan. The municipality put in with other professionals made that master plan. But now that the more that I think about the surroundings, the more I think that I don't want that surroundings to become something like Central Park, for example, where the surroundings become this privileged area, circulating around the park. And, with time, those buildings, those sites become super expensive and privileged for just a few people. So the more that I think about that master plan regarding the surroundings, the more I'm against that. The size of the lots that surround the entire urban fabric around the airport are so small that it's very difficult, gladly, to develop buildings or things like that unless they combine an entire block, for example. So that's a very key factor also that I'm super happy that is not happening. That developers have not found the way to invest because of these complexities that are behind. So I hope it keeps like the surroundings are still like that. As we have them now, it will be wonderful because it's a site surrounded by middle to lower class people. So I think it will be fantastic to keep it like that. It's for the public and it should be for the people.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Mirka, you have a question?
Just have a question right on top of Leora's. First of all, I want to say very much like Sarah that it was a beautiful talk, Ernesto. I too have heard you speak about your project a number of times, but this was the most synthetic, the most interwoven and really clear. And I'm going to actually ask you to please give this to my class next spring. It's so fabulous. It must be repeated. I'm sure you're repeating it in many public venues. But I had a question related to Leora's about access to the park. Do you have families walking 2-3 miles with little children? How is public transportation serving this great length? Could you talk a little bit about physical access to the park for people all over Quito?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Mirka. It's so wonderful to see you also. Yeah, it's a very good question. When the weird thing about the site of the airport is that it was not surrounded by roads or avenues or vehicular infrastructure. It was neighbored by houses, by regular people adjacent to the site. So it was very difficult to have or to create these particular sites for entrances. So according to the master plan that I developed before the opening of the park, I remember that I walked around the entire site in order to find particular places that would facilitate the creation of those entrances, especially from the neighborhoods that surround the park. So gladly, I found very few of those, and those were the points where we put more emphasis in order to design like very temporary infrastructure in order to accommodate parking lots and things like that, restaurants and things like that, places for shading and so on. But we found those. Now, especially towards the south of the park, especially towards the west, there was an area where most of the hangars were located. Now, the cultural promenade that was proposed in competition is now built. And gladly, all those hangars have been disassembled, and they are not there anymore. So now we have a very long, very elongated boulevard that allows people to enter freely from that section. So it's a very interesting moment also to see the airport from that side. the rest of the park also still limits or borders with other neighborhoods, so it's very difficult to create other entrances unless we extend the important avenues around the site, and pretty much kind of in order to divide, the neighborhoods with the park. But yeah, we thought of that in order to facilitate and to populate the park as much as possible.
Right. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Mirka.
We are getting very close to 1 p.m. and the Friday Forum traditions, as established by Michael Benedict, is that by 1 p.m. we thank everybody for coming. We know that everybody have all their commitments, and we will stay on for a little bit if anybody else have a question or wants to comment on anything on Ernesto's presentation. Thank you, Ernesto. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Hi.
No? Yes.
I do actually. Can you hear me?
Yes, Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi. So nice to see you, Ernesto, and thank you for your talk. I'm just curious to understand how do you feel about doing historical research on a site you're very much connected with? It's something that I struggle with, particularly. I wouldn't feel comfortable about researching 4 years and a PhD, doing that kind of research on the site that I've been hands-on producing and being an active stakeholder in that development in a way or another. And I'm just curious to learn a little bit more about you. Like, how do you feel? Like, how do you balance those things? Do you separate yourself, or do you feel like, no, I'm part of this and I need to dig further to understand the site and the city and the site and the park?
It's a great question, Barbara, because I always think about of that. Like every day is like, sometimes I think that I'm an architect with my mind is, works as an architect, and then now I have, my heart belongs to architectural history. But probably, I'm very enthusiastic about landscape architecture as well. So it's like I'm a combination of all of those things. So it's hard to decide sometimes is what is that I really want to be. But when I work on my dissertation, on my ongoing dissertation, I always think of how maybe I need to disconnect myself from what I'm writing in order to kind of create a different perspective, right? But I'm also, but I also see that, my knowledge, the accumulated knowledge that I have gathered around this site in the last 12 years also informs my work when I write my dissertation. For example, in this presentation, it was very interesting to think, this is something that I wanted to create in this presentation. I sort of wanted you to go from the air to the ground and then to the air again to the ground, right? It was the discourse wanted to emphasize that, right? That movement. And I guess that happens also with me in the sense that sometimes I'm the architect that was part of the history of that site, in the last 12 years, but I'm also, informing from that perspective and then going back to the site, finding other factors and then combining those together. And, I think everything informs, to the project, to the things that I'm doing now. And I think that's a fascinating thing. The problem that I found sometimes is when I want to write an article, for example, I cannot write about my own work, right? I wouldn't be able to write an article for a journal, for example, talking about the history of the site, and then suddenly say that I was the author of the project, right? I mean, it kind of add some kind of issues of publicity, which I don't want to address in any article. So particularly that is a particular conflict that I have, when it's about publishing. So there, when it's about publishing, is maybe when I disconnect, my work from a practitioner or a historian, right?
I wonder if we have any other questions from the audience.
I have a question.
Nick.
Hey, Ernesto.
Hey.
So I missed the first part of the presentation. So I don't know if you talked a little bit about this, but I see that you also did a competition for La Carolina Park in Quito. And that's also a really large park in Quito. And then this project is even larger. Did that competition have any effect, give you any idea or precedence for this project?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting thing that you're bringing to the table. Yeah, I also won the competition. It was a national competition for the redesign of the La Carolina Park. That competition took place in 2001. I was just graduated from school. And it was a very interesting experience because it kind of, when I won the competition for the Parque del Lago, for the airport site, the previous experience that I had in other parks, and including the one for the La Carolina Park, it really made me see things differently. And one thing in particular that I remember from the La Carolina competition is that I collected these aerial photographs from the 1950s, the 1960s of the La Carolina Park, which was not a park by then. And I found this very amazing information about all the ravines and gorges and forests that covered the site back then. So that really informed my proposal for that competition. It was very interesting that we kind of assimilated, because it was a competition that I participated with other two colleagues. So that really informed us in order to make the decisions for that proposal. And so the aerial view was pretty much embedded in my mind since then, and that was a particular strategy that I kind of integrated into my practice. Every time that I designed a park or designed a project in Quito or in Ecuador, I always wanted to look for old photographs to see and to understand the historical transformation of those sites, and to see if those transformations can inform the design process. So sadly, I mean, nothing happened around that competition. We developed a master plan right after winning the competition, which was a very interesting proposal, but it never happened. But still, it kind of, winning that competition kind of gave me some recognition when I won the Parque del Lago competition, because when I won the Parque del Lago competition, I was the only Ecuadorian in the list of all the winners. So it kind of gave me credit, everybody knew that I already have won that competition. So it kind of gave me credit and credibility after winning the Parque del Lago competition. So yeah, it's a very interesting connection that I have with that park. Thank you, Nick, for your question.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
One final question from the audience. Oh. Thank you, Ernesto, for an amazing presentation. I think you did a tremendous job to start our CAD Friday forums this semester. Thank you so much. Thanks, Leora, for making it happen.
Thank you. And everyone, please join us again in 2 weeks for the next round. We'll have the team from the St. John's Project presenting. So we hope to see you again then.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
You too. Goodbye.